In this presentation, we'll be talking about writing outcomes. I'm Abby Hahne, and I am our Assessment Director and teach chemistry at Danville Area Community College. Our topics we'll be going over today are: what is an outcome? How do we write outcomes? How do we choose verbs for a well-written outcome? How do we know if an outcome is written well? Why outcomes matter, and then where outcomes are used at Danville Area Community College. First of all, what is an outcome? An outcome is a statement clearly describing what a student should be able to do once they've completed a course, program, or any other task. Outcomes include an action verb and then the content. So what will the student be learning in your course or your program or whatever they're doing? An example using what we're doing today, the student will be able to evaluate an outcome for measurability. Evaluate is our verb. It's clear as to what the student should be doing. And then what we are doing is looking at the measurability of an outcome. So that's our content, or what the student will be learning. First of all, how do we even write an outcome? If you're brand new at this, it can seem very difficult. And after you've practiced a while, outcome writing gets easier and easier. But the best place I find to start, especially if you don't know where to begin, is actually just create a list of what you expect your students to be able to do after they've completed your course or program or whatever activity you're looking at. Even thinking about if you have certain tests or tasks that students do. So think through what they would be doing in your course. And then after that, you may also want to look at any outside accrediting bodies, like if you're a nursing program or anything like that. The IAI, so the Illinois Articulation Initiative, requirements if your course is going to be applying for that, and then any national requirements relating to your course or your program. Then we use the following format at DACC. You'll see this statement actually written into our course outline template where we list out the course outcomes. And it says, upon completion of this course, the student will be able to, then there should be the verb, and then your content. Now, if you're just writing outcomes in general or for your program, you could just use the phrase, the student will be able to, ... Couple of things to watch out for. We want to use one verb per statement and use a measurable verb. Now, measurable verbs, we'll talk about what it looks like to have a good measurable verb or not. We have some good examples of outcomes that are not written so well, and then how we could fix those. So how do we choose a verb? You want to think about the action that the student will be doing and a verb that clearly describes that. So think about what the student's going to do to show you that they know the content, and then also maybe any tests you might be giving the student. If they're going to have to write a paper, or if they're going to have to design something or evaluate something, think about those tasks that student will be doing. Determine what level of achievement you might expect. Are your students doing some basic activities with this? Are they listing it? Do they have to define things? Or are they going to compile all of their knowledge and create a business plan, or those kinds of things? So think about what you're wanting out of that student. One way to figure out what level of achievement you're using, you might think about, is this a higher level or is this an introductory level course? You also can consult Bloom's taxonomy. There's a video created by Marcy that talks through Bloom's taxonomy. And remember, that describes the level of someone's learning. So there are different verbs that are used at each level. We have our basic level, and then as students advance in their knowledge, they should be able to complete these other activities. There are a lot of lists of verbs out there that relate back to Bloom's taxonomy. There are some available from DACC, or really if you Google Bloom's taxonomy, you should be able to find a lot of lists of verbs that could relate specifically to your particular program or course. Most courses, even if they're lower level, have a variety of Bloom's levels. Now, I expect my introductory course to maybe be a little bit heavier on the lower end of the Bloom's pyramid, but we still should be able to have some of the higher level activities in there too. So don't restrict your course based on is it introductory or is it higher level, but just know that yes, there should be a little bit of a difference between what the students are doing in a lower level or a higher level course, but make sure you have a good variety. Just as a reminder, let's quick work our way through Bloom's taxonomy. The pyramid here shows us that the base is remembering, which if you remember, that's our listing, defining, recognizing facts. So the very basics of your course or of our learning level. The next level, understanding. If a student is demonstrating their understanding, they're able to describe, maybe translate, they could restate something in their own words. Then after that, we have the application level. So they're going to take the knowledge they have, apply it to something, or make that knowledge useful. After that, we can analyze, and analyzing really hits a lot of different things, but to be able to analyze, you've also got to be able to remember, understand facts, and then apply that to different areas. After that, we have evaluate. So this is where students are making judgments about maybe a paper, the value of something, validity of claims. They should be able to select and defend positions. And then last but not least, we have the synthesis or create area of the pyramid. And so create is kind of like we've taken all these other things and we're making something new. The student is able to design something new based on their current knowledge. Bloom's levels, like I said, these are good to help us know how we want our students to do certain things. It's helpful to set this aside or set this alongside as you're working through writing your outcomes. And you might want to find a good list of verbs that you like that is helpful for your particular course. So if you need any of those or would like help identifying good Bloom's verbs for your outcomes, feel free to ask or let me know, and I would be happy to help. So let's take a look at some examples of outcomes. I just picked a general set of things that students should be able to do after completing a particular course. I didn't have one in mind, but I mentioned if you start out with your course or your program and you're trying to write outcomes, list out some things that you know a student should be able to do once they've completed the course. So the first one I say is work safely using nationally recognized safety standards. This hits a lot of different courses and programs. The next thing that I said my students should be able to do once completing their program is communicate effectively. The next one is students should be able to properly use equipment related to their career. So these are just a few examples of what students should be able to do in my example course. So possible outcomes that I could write for each one of those, and you'll notice I have several outcomes for each one of these. We don't have to just have one statement per listing of what we should be able to do, but you could. So the student will be able to, so we follow that format. First of all, they should be able to utilize safety standards while working. Okay, use the safety standards. They should be able to list the safety standards. Apply safety standards to new situations. So maybe the student's given a situation and then they have to figure out how the safety standards relate to that. The next one says identify unsafe working conditions. Now, identify you'll actually find in a couple of different places in Bloom's verbs. Identify is actually in the most basic part, but you can also put it in a higher level. For example, I would say that this is an example of applying this particular concept. So it's an application level because the student is able to look at safety standards and then identify or pick out where there are unsafe working conditions. And so this is a little bit higher level, but be aware that sometimes your verbs can be listed in a lower level, but the activity is higher level too. So we have a lot of flexibility with those verbs. The second one says students need to communicate effectively in their future careers. We all know that communication is very important, and it's going to look different no matter what career or what topic area we're covering. So in mine, I gave the examples of the students should be able to write a diagnostic report. They should be able to describe repairs to a customer. And so one thing you'll have to think about if you're working in a certificate program or a particular course or program that maybe doesn't have traditional communication or traditional other things that we think about. Most of us, when we think about communication, we think along the lines of writing a paper, or we think about giving a presentation or a speech. Well, your students may not do that, but they may still be communicating. And you can see we have two different forms of communication that are a little non-traditional for us. So keep that in mind that you may be thinking outside the box, but those Bloom's lists, those verbs can be really helpful when you're writing these outcomes. The next one says students should be able to properly use equipment. Well, maybe the student will be able to test electrical circuits with a multimeter. Maybe the student is going to outline a procedure for servicing an engine, or outline a procedure for some other kind of task. So you can see I have a lot of variety here. And if you look at this, I'm going to be hitting all different Bloom's levels as well. So this is just one example of how we can take a list and write outcomes from that. So how do we know if we did a good job writing our outcomes? Well, there are a few key mistakes that people make that we can highlight. One is, did you write the outcome in terms of what the student is doing? It's very easy sometimes for us to list out what we do as instructors. So you have to think, did I just write out what I'm going to do or what the student is doing to show me that they know this particular topic or concept? Did you use one verb per statement? It's also very easy to say, okay, the student's going to list and describe. So in that situation, we'll talk about how to deal with that, but you want to think about, is it important to have both statements? Should the student be able to list this and then also describe? Or can we take both of those two terms and put it into a higher level Bloom's statement? I'll show you an example of that later. Some phrases to watch out for are know, understand. So if you say the student will know the types of matter, well, saying that is difficult because how do I know that the students know? What are the actions then that the student has to take to show me they know this? So know and understand are very vague terms when we come to outcome statements. So remember, it should be super clear what the student is doing. The next one says students will be introduced to. So that's actually an example of when I might write an outcome in terms of what I do instead of what the student does. The next one, appreciate a topic. Appreciation, how do you measure someone's appreciation? And so once again, it's kind of like know and understand. How do you know? What are the actions that that student will take to show that they're appreciating this particular topic? So those are some common pitfalls that make outcome statements unmeasurable. It's very difficult to then measure an outcome if it's vague or if we're doing these particular things. Remember that an outcome describes what the student will do to show their knowledge. So let's take a look at some outcome examples. I'm going to give you a poorly written outcome and then talk about the issue and then how we could make that more measurable. So one example that I've listed here is familiarize the student with the safety standards. Our issue is that this is written in terms of what the instructor is going to do. So what will the student do to show their knowledge? That's what we have to ask. So the next thing we want to look at is What could we do to make that measurable? Well, we could say the student will be able to utilize safety standards while working. Our next poorly written outcome says plan, describe, and present a business plan. Hopefully you recognize that that is when we've used too many verbs. So to write a better outcome, we want to pick one of those verbs. We could write out all three of those outcomes separately or choose the higher level verb. I went ahead and said those 3 steps all could be encompassed using the verb create. The student will create a business plan. If we're creating a business plan, most likely we have to plan it, we have to describe it, and then usually you're going to have to then present that. So create takes care of all 3 of those in one step. The last one says appreciate selected major British writers. Once again, this is that appreciation word we have to watch out for. So we want to choose a specific verb that clearly outlines what the student is doing. So I might be able to say, compare the major contributions of British writers to the literature. So this particular one is a good example of how we could take a slightly unmeasurable word, that appreciate, and turn it into something more measurable. It's very easy for me to then say, oh, well, if the student is appreciating it, they can compare these things. So why do outcomes matter? Clear outcomes help improve student learning. This helps us show the student what our expectations are, and it also gives them a good idea as to what they have to actually do to achieve in your class, to do well. What students should do to accomplish your course outcomes, or what they should be able to do well in your course, shouldn't be a mystery. Well-written outcomes are not teaching to the test. It's actually just providing a clear list of expectations that the student could use to study from. So if you provide them with the outcomes, they'll be able to see, oh, I should be able to define these terms. I should be able to then apply that to this situation. So it actually is a helpful tool for your students in addition to yourself. It can help you writing homework, quizzes, and exams. If you have clear outcome statements, it's very clear then how to write a test question from that. It also helps us in our assessment. So when we look for how well the student is improving, we can have a very clear and concise measure of, well, the student wasn't doing well here, but they are now. And so it just makes that process a lot simpler. It also helps with transparency. If we think about students transferring to other universities, completing a certificate, if we have good outcomes, then it's clear to the transfer university, to your people taking on certificate students, what those students were able to do in your courses. Where do we use outcomes at DACC? Well, outcomes come from our mission statement. And so we have outcomes in a lot of different places. We have the outcomes that relate to the entire institution, so the general education outcomes, which are communication, critical thinking, social and cultural awareness, and technology. Then from that, we can get our program and course outcomes. So those all relate back. Then we also have, outside of academics, we have non-academic departments, so our student services, advising, and then we also have co-curricular outcomes, which are groups that kind of bridge the gap, some of our tutoring services, some of our societies, or maybe internships, those sorts of things. So we use outcomes in a lot of different places, and really what it helps us do when we have well-written outcomes, we can look at how well our students are doing. Are they doing what we say they are, and how well, and do we see improvement? So after you've seen this presentation, here are the things that you should be able to do. You should be able to describe a measurable outcome. You should be able to write a measurable outcome, choose appropriate verbs for writing outcomes, evaluate outcomes for measurability, list applications of well-written outcomes, and describe where we use outcomes at DACC. If you would like more help, feel free to visit the assessment website. We have a lot of different materials there, and also some of the information that's in this presentation is available there as well. You could work with the assessment champions or myself, the assessment director, or find another faculty member on campus who's been doing this for a while. And you can also ask your dean who would be helpful or if they could help you as well. So feel free if you need any help writing your outcomes to let me know. I'd be happy to help.